Welcome back. In this video, we're going to create a pulse that will happen when the item is interping so that we get a flash when the weapon flies up to our face. So let's go ahead and get started. Now we're going to create a new curve. So let's go into our curves folder and right click and in miscellaneous choose curve, and this will be a curve vector, just like the material pulse curve. Now I'm going to call this material interp curve, and we're going to open this up. Now I'm also going to open the item Z curve so we can see the trend that the item is following in the Z when interping. So you'll see that we go up and then hover at this part in the curve from 0.3 seconds to 0.6 seconds. So somewhere in between 0.3 and 0.6 is where I want to flash our pulse. So let's go to our material interp curve and right click and add a key and drag it down, right click, add another key and drag it up, and right click and add a key. And this way we have our different X, Y, and Z components separated. Now the X is going to be our glow amount, just like we had in our other curve. And I'd like to start off the glow amount to be at 0 and 0. So at time 0, it will have a value of 0. Now, again, with our item Z curve, we see that between 0.3 and 0.6 seconds, this is where we want our flash. So on material pulse curve, I'm going to add a new key. I'm going to add another key, and I'm going to add a fourth key. And the fourth key is going to be right at the end, and that's about 0.7 seconds. So the fourth key is going to be at 0.7 in the time, and I'll keep it at 0 for the value. Now it looks like I have two key points on top of each other, so I'm going to have to go ahead and drag those away from each other. And I just want the last one to be at time 0.7 and 0. Now I want the second key point to go up to a value of 1 at about 0.35 seconds. So it'll be 0.35 and 1. And the third point, I'm going to have it go up to 1 at about 0.55 seconds. So it'll be 0.55 and 1. So I can scroll out and we'll see that it looks like this. Now I'm going to go ahead and click and drag to select everything and click on zoom to fit, so that way it's scaled in a way that we can see this very easily. Now I want this to start going up right at about 0.3 seconds. So I'm going to right click and add a key and put it at 0.3 and 0. And I'm going to also right click and add a key and put this at 0.6 and 0. So essentially what our curve is doing is it's remaining at 0 until 0.3, then it jumps up to 1 at 0.35, and then at 0.55 it starts to go down, and by 0.6 it goes down to 0 again. Again, looking at the item Z curve, we have 0.3 to 0.6, so at 0.35 it goes up, and then at 0.55 it goes back down. So that's the glow amount. Now the Y is going to be the Fresnel exponent. Now for the Y, I'm going to create some keys as well. I'll put 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I'm adding more keys here for a total of 6. Now I want the Fresnel exponent to start off up here at 1, and I want it to remain at 1 all the way up to this point in time, 0.3 seconds. At which point I want it to drop down to 0 at the same time that the glow amount comes up to 1, and that's 0.35. So I'm going to make this 0.35 and 0. And I want it to remain at 0 all the way up to 0.55 seconds. So I'm going to put it 0.55 and 0, at which point then I want it to shoot back up to 1, and that's going to be at time 0.6. And I want it to remain at 1, so I'm going to go ahead and put this last part at 0.7 and 1. So it's kind of like the glow amount, which starts at 0, jumps up to 1, and then back down to 0, only it starts at 1, drops down to 0, and then jumps back up to 1. Now for the Fresnel reflect factor, we're going to add some keys to this. So we have one already. It's going to be at 0, 0. I'm going to add another, and another, and another, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now for the reflect factor, I want it to start off at -1 and 0. So I'm going to bring it down to -1. I want it to stay at -1 all the way up to 0.3. And then I want it to jump up to 0 at 0.35. So I'm going to make this one 0.35 and 0. I want it to remain at 0 up to 0.55, so the next point will be 0.55 and 0, and then after that I want it to drop back down to -1 and remain at -1 for the rest of the curve. So the Fresnel reflect factor starts off at -1, and then it jumps up to 0 and then back down to -1. Okay, great. So now we have our pulse curve. Now let's set this up in C++ so we can use this. So here we are in item.h, and I'm going to go up here where we have our pulse curve. Let's make another pulse curve, and this will be for interping. So I'm going to copy this and paste it, and I don't need the class keyword here because we've already forward declared it above. And I'm going to call this one material pulse curve. Now let's use this material pulse curve. Let's go back into item.cpp and go to our update pulse function. And here in update pulse, this is where we're setting the dynamic material instance using the pulse curve, but now we have two different curves to choose from. So what we can do is rearrange this a bit so that we're switching on the item state. So before we just checked to see if the state was in the pickup state, but now we have multiple states to check. Instead, I'm going to create a switch statement, and I'm going to switch on item state. And I'm going to take our elapsed time, and instead of making it a const float, I'm going to delete this elapsed time. And I'm just going to declare elapsed time up at the top, not a const, but just a float, and call this elapsed time. And I'm going to use braced initialization. And I'm also going to create an f vector and call this curve value using braced initialization as well. Now for switching on item state, we're going to have two states that we're going to check. One is going to be the item state EIS pickup, and we'll have a break there. And then next we'll have a case item state equip interping, and that's going to be for when we're interping, and we'll have a break there. Now if we're in the pickup state, we're going to check to see if the pulse curve is valid, and if that's the case, then we can set elapsed time and curve value, and we'll do that here. We're going to say elapsed time equals get world timer manager, get timer elapsed, passing in pulse timer. And we're going to get our curve value, and that's going to be pulse curve, get vector value, passing in elapsed time. So that's what we're going to do if the case is pickup, but if the case is equip interping, then we're going to check to see if we have our material pulse curve. And I'm now realizing that material pulse curve might be a bit of a confusing name. They're both pulse curves for the material. This one just happens to be for when we're interping. So I'm going to actually rename this to interp pulse curve. Interp pulse curve. So this will be interp pulse curve, and that's what we're going to check here. And that makes a lot more sense because in the editor we called our curve material interp curve. So if interp pulse curve is valid, then we can use these two lines here, but instead of our pulse timer, we're going to be using our interp timer. So let's go up and make sure we remember what that timer handle was called. It's called item interp timer. We're going to use that because we're in the equip interping state, so that timer is going to be running, and we can use item interp timer to get that elapsed time. Now, the curve value is going to be get vector value, but not from pulse curve, it's going to be from interp pulse curve. So now we'll have our elapsed time and our curve value. So then all that's left to do is set the dynamic material instances, and we don't need to use this if check, and we don't need this const f vector curve value anymore, since we already have those values. So I'm going to go ahead and copy these 3 lines where we're setting the dynamic material instance parameter value, and then delete those and paste those 3 lines right here. And then I see that my break needs a semicolon. You might have noticed that. And so now we have our update pulse function working for both the pickup and the equip interping states. So we have our float elapsed time and curve value, and then we switch on item state. If it's the pickup state, then we set elapsed time using the pulse timer, and then we set the curve value using the pulse curve. But if it's in the equip interping state, then we get our elapsed time using item interp timer instead, and we get our curve value using interp pulse curve instead. Then we set our dynamic material instance just like we were before. So before we compile this, one more thing we need to do is clear the timer when we start the item curve. So let's go back to start item curve, and as soon as we set the state to equip interping, we need to clear the pulse timer handle so it's no longer running. So we're going to get world timer manager and clear timer, and the timer we're clearing is the pulse timer, like that. And the last thing we're going to do is right here in finish interping, after we've picked up the item, we're going to set the item state to picked up, that way it won't glow anymore. So we're going to, right here in the if character check, right after we get pickup item, we're going to call set item state, and we'll set it to e item state picked up. And one last thing before we compile, we need to check to make sure dynamic material instance is valid before we set these parameters. So let's go ahead and put these in their own if check as well. Okay, so let's compile this and we'll give it a test run. So here we are in base weapon BP, and we're going to set our interp pulse curve to material interp curve and compile that. Now we can go ahead and play and test this out. So first we see that the regular pulse is working. There it goes. And now we're going to go ahead and pick one of these up, and we saw that it flashed right as it flew up to our face. So we get that nice flash there. Okay, so that looks good. Now, before we wrap this up, if we want, we can take our material interp curve and we can make these curves more smooth rather than just being jagged. So I could take this glow alpha, the red one, and select these 2 points, right click and select auto, and now we've got these auto handles so that we can make this a little bit more smooth. I'm going to go ahead and make these a little bit more smooth, and then I'll go ahead and get these 2 points here and give them auto and make them a little smoother. Next I'll get the green, and I might have to move this key out of the way for the Z, and that's okay, I'll move it back later. So I'll go ahead and give these 2 auto, and I'll move this key out of the way, and I'll give these 2 auto, just these 2 keys on the green. And then finally, I'll give these 2 auto and these 2 auto as well. And then I can move these points back. Looks like it's going to be 0.35 and 0 for this one. 0.35 and 0. And then 0.55 and 0 for this one, 0.55 and 0. And now our curves are a little bit smoother. So let's save that, and now we can play test this again, pick up an item. And it's a very subtle difference. It's almost hard to tell, but it is a little bit smoother. Now, if you aren't happy with the way that these parameters are changing, you can just come in here and change the curve. The only thing to keep in mind is the length of time passing, because that's going to correspond with the time for the timer. Okay, that's going to wrap up this. Now we have our materials changing dynamically, and we can also affect the color of these pulses, but we're going to do that later when we set up data tables. So data tables are going to allow us to just set a single property on a particular object, and then everything else will be set automatically for us. We're going to set that up in a future video. But in the next video, we're going to get started on an inventory system, so that way we can have multiple items on our person at any given point in time, and then we can switch between our different weapons. So very exciting. All right, we'll see you in the next video.